yeah, I don't really know if it is the same as promised in my proposal that I wrote a few days ago, but it's still trying to sort of like poke into this kind of place where art becomes magic, becomes politics to a certain extent, or where they overlap and maybe complement each other. So I'll just start out reading my paper here. So I want to address the porous border between fictions and reality throughout the long 20th century, speaking from like the mid-19th century till today, basically, where fictions seem to have made themselves real just as often as reality has become stranger than fiction, especially in the speculative genres such as the weird, horror, science fiction, and what one could call the literature of the occult. The two seem to be constantly blurred, as these genres are often preoccupied with the new and unknown, trying to make something happen. To begin, I'll address the role of myths in shaping our realities. Then I'll move on to a few examples that have tried to either realize fictions to create utopia or to fictionalize reality to shape it and bend it to their will. Before I'll end with a short discussion of the implications of these weird strategies of myth fictioning and religioning. Already the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico, who lived from 1668 to 1744, argued that poets and other creators bring up new metaphors that are new ways of seeing ourselves and the world. In Vico's sense of the term, all creators are poets, Newton as much as Homer, since they give us a whole world. When these visions are spread among a people, they become myths and they become law. New metaphors and myths are found all the time in a process that can be violent and explosive, where a new myth can trigger a war between the classes. This is also the understanding of myth that was formulated in the early 20th century by people like the French philosopher Georges Sorel or the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer. Art, in its widest sense, should create images that could be used to act upon the present. These images are myths that can appeal directly to feelings instead of the intellect. So they're myths of feelings in the form of an image, and they are meant to inflame people, to make a break with the past without thought for the future. They're bits of images and stories to navigate the present after, not unlike what the writer William Burroughs later would call a virus, as they are contagious. And I guess the same sort of mechanism is also what we today could call memes or hyperstitions, to use a more sort of theoretical concept. But this kind of bits that wants us to sort of like behave in a certain way or act in a certain way, or just inflame us. One of the key concerns for various creative endeavors in the 20th century was to produce myths that would make existing myths superfluous. Burroughs famously wanted to create a new myth for the space age, but the central myth of the 20th century has arguably been an idea about speculative evolution. This myth tells us that we are on the brink of an evolutionary quantum leap that can be forced, an idea that has appeared again and again in speculative fictions, where there seems to be a general agreement on that this leap will begin in consciousness, i.e. with mind expansion, or by unlocking the brain's hidden potential, like psi powers and all that kind of stuff. According to this myth, we need to embrace change and mutation to go forward, and we need to think in another, more non-Aristotelian way, which might mean thinking more in terms of similarities than in causalities, which, magical thinking, right? This can be helped along not only by doing heroic doses of psychoactive drugs, but also by taking controls of our own narratives and begin to actively fictionalize the world. This is no secret for the practitioners of magic, as this is what they have done since times immemorial, trying to change the world by will alone, while treating fictions as realities, or as reality and reality as fiction. In a literary perspective, the modern occult, as it came to prominence in the mid-19th century with the French occult revival, can be seen as entangled with the rise of the symbolist movement and rooted in the romantic movement of the early decades of that century. When the occult was forced underground after the Renaissance, it became a kind of garbage can category for rejected knowledge, as both James Webb and Wouter Hanegraaff have pointed out. This meant that it became a genre where dilettantes and amateurs took over and used bits and pieces to create fictions and wild speculations. This interplay between the speculative and the real has since come to dominate the trajectory of the modern occult in a back-and-forth movement. To give a few quick examples, the French writer and revolutionary Alphonse Louis Constant wrote an occult novel, The Wizard of Meudon, in 1847, before he, under the name Eliphas Lévy, wrote The History of Magic in 1860, which can be seen as one of the first attempts at bringing occult knowledge together as a coherent and continuous tradition going back to Hellenic times, and thus a cornerstone for the modern occult. Lévy peppered his history with invented doctrines of Rosicrucianism, which itself is seen by many as a literary prank by the utopian philosopher Johann Valentin André in the early 17th century. Lévy's translator, Arthur Edward Waite, recycled and elaborated some of these ideas in a series of scholarly fantasies that in turn exercised a powerful influence on William Butler Yeats, Arthur Machen, Aleister Crowley, and Diane Fortune, just like Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky borrow from the occult novels of Edward Bulwer Lytton, such as Zanoni from 1842 or The Coming Race from 1870, where the former also inspired Lévy with its type of faux Rosicrucianism. Closer to our own time, there's also the relationship between chaos magic and the writings of H.P. Lovecraft, who in turn were inspired by the fancies of Margaret Murray, who had sensed that witchcraft was the survival of a pre-Christian cult. All this just to highlight the back-and-forth movement between fiction and reality in the speculative realms, where the distinctions between art, politics, and magic often become totally blurred. But this also means that the modern occult can be seen as an example of what the cultural philosopher Raymond Williams called residual culture, where secret, forgotten, or hidden histories, the rejected knowledge, might enable a form of resistance to the narratives of the dominant culture. An example of one of these residual cultures, blurring the distinctions between fiction, reality, politics, art, and magic, that I think has something to offer our contemporary, is the kindred of the Kibbo Kift, who sprang out of the woodcraft movement and were active here in Britain in the 1920s. And I just brought a few pictures to show the Kift in all the glory. Along the lines of Madame Blavatsky's earlier Theosophical Society, the Kift tried to create a new type of humanity, where they not only romanticized the ways and relations to nature of the Native American, but also wanted to create a future formed around a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinctions to race, creed, sex, caste, or color, while simultaneously encouraging the comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy, as well as studying the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in the human mind. The Kift had connections to both theosophy, sort of like Golden Dawn type magic, and to surrealism. Their photographer, Angus MacBean, later became a surrealist, and it's also actually kind of, as far as I remember, I think he took one of those famous pictures of the Beatles where they're standing, so he also feeds into the counterculture of the 60s, if one want to make a line. But the Kift tried to design a whole new society from the bottom up with new types of clothes and and all while they at the same time are an example of a reality fiction interaction, where readers are moving from consuming ideas to actively trying to organize futurist ways of living. I'm just going to show just a few of these pictures. I mean, this is the leader over here that took like Indian names when they were sort of baptized into the new way of living. So the leader over here, White Fox, is John Hargrave, who was the leader who he began in the Scout movement and formed the Kift, and they had these sort of like medieval clothings where they were walking around the countryside and living a new kind of nature cult. This is their ark. They had mysteries. They had a tent of initiation where you would be sort of like exposed to a type of Golden Dawn psychodramatic initiations. And then they walked in these formations that Angus MacBean is sort of like beautifully capturing. When they walked around, to a certain extent, they had these field trips to Stonehenge and stuff like that. So an early kind of psychogeography, I guess you could call it as well. They had these tents also in weird camouflage colors, and I just kept a little thing. Like they made a new calendar, so they made a year 0 in 1920 when they began the Kift, and then they had this thing that you should be able to make all the things you were carrying around, because that would make you ready for living post-civilization, i.e. sort of a type of survivalism. So inspired by the writings of especially H. Rider Haggard, James Fenimore Cooper, H.G. Wells, and James Fraser, the Kift wanted to re-enchant the modern world through the myths and mysteries of an earlier, more primitive time, and find solutions to the perceived social calamities of the civilized world through their own specific brand of intellectual barbarianism. Due to time limitations, I'll not go into details here about the structure of the Kift, but just refer to, for example, Annabella Polland's book about them, and I just want to highlight that they engaged in a future-oriented practice that involved the utilization of past myths and folklore, albeit in new and novel combinations. So they were sort of re-mythologizing or creating their own myths for a future primitivism. As all tricksters, they operated within a given regime to subvert its terms while trying to fiction the future into the present. The Kibbo future involved populating their own land, intended to be called Kingarth, with the offspring of the present Kifters, making the project one of evolutionary futurism, which, due to that its creation of a new world through a collective focused intention, is closer to magic than to science. John Hargrave, the central leader of the Kift, wanted to create new social and religious forms, to which end he, for example, provided various rituals in their writings, but without placing them in a specific context, in the hope that the practitioners would be content providers and create their own mysteries built up around these rituals. Magical thinking and a new barbarianism became existential strategies of disentanglement from a contemporary world of technology and science. This way of fictioning is a way of reclaiming a sense of agency. It's an expression of the individual's power to reshape the experience of reality over the power of the socially hegemonic reality system, often through an engagement with the so-called weird, which is this liminal category preoccupied with the outside and the other. By reshaping the fundamental categories of thought and experience, this type of weird fictioning points towards other political and social structures. Another example that looked to science fiction instead of folklore and Native Americans was the creation of so-called slan centers during the 1940s. These were based primarily on A.E. Van Vocht's science fiction novel Slan, originally serialized from September to December 1940 in Astounding Science Fiction. In Slan, we encounter a type of superhumans who have evolved psychic abilities while also having higher intelligence and stronger bodies. The Slan centers consisted of fans of primarily science fiction, but also other types of speculative fiction, who began to make communes centered around the slogan, "Fans are Slans," thus anticipating the counterculture of the 1950s and 1960s with its preoccupation with communal living and mind expansion. Slan centers became fan utopias based on an idea of becoming islands in the net, and some of them evolved to become the so-called cosmic circle of the late 1940s, where the inhabitants, just like in the Kift, experimented with free love and fan families that should breed a coming humanity, even if they never really took off, partly because some of their ideas in the wake of World War II too closely resembled Nazi discussions about eugenics, and partly, I guess, because the wider counterculture took off in the early 1950s with beat and all that kind of stuff, right? So both the Kift and the Cosmic Circle can be seen as attempts to make a certain type of speculative or weird fiction real, which suggests that these genres, and the weird in general, are inflationary in the sense that they're able to re-enchant and make reality seem grander and bigger than it arguably is, while opening up for experiments with that which the human might become. By establishing islands in the net, they're creating an outside within, which becomes a place to reignite the process of social imagination, even if it is more fabulative than it is proper utopian in the sense of politics. By fictioning another world from within this one, they do not promise another world here and now. Instead, they promise new ways or different modes of being, where they're engendering new subjectivities and collectivities through experiments with rituals and various world-making practices. Today, fake news make real news while conspiracy theories are thriving, and it is possible that the reciprocal loop between fiction and reality has accelerated in a way that fundamentally destabilizes what we can talk about as the truth, even if reality still might be, in the words of American science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, that which, when you stop believing it, doesn't go away. To call another weirder and wilder world into existence, what we need is not just new symbols, new languages, and new myths to live by, but creative acts of world building and intention. On this note, and to wrap it all up, instead of a conclusion, I want to share with you the necessary steps to build a complete system according to Timothy Leary, himself no stranger to the blurring between fiction and reality, as his Smile project of the 1970s were in as much debt to the science fiction writer Robert Heinlein as it was to contemporary scientific research into space migration, increased intelligence, and life extension. So, what we need, according to, there's just a little kif more with the clothes. I think that's from an exhibition at the Whitechapel a few years ago, and they had all these pins and totally trying to design a world from below to above, maybe. And then Timothy Leary's complete system for kind of world building or world making. So he says he wrote it in the 70s while he was imprisoned, so he had a lot of time to think about. The simple way would saying that a myth needs a cosmogony, a cosmology, and an eschatology, because then it tells us where we're coming from, where we are, and where we're going. But he is expanding it a bit, so he says what we need to build a complete system or as a world-making practice is a cosmology, a political theory, an epistemology, an ethics, an aesthetics, an ontology, a theology, and an eschatology. And discuss what is lacking in it with me, please, because I'm kind of fascinated by this idea about trying to conceptualize everything, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, questions?
Yeah, Ariel?
I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but perhaps there's some kind of friction between fact and fiction. But in fact, this fiction is actually a frisson, fusion between fact and fiction, confusing the facts with impossible acts. And it seems that these two opposing factions between those who believe in frisson and fusion betwixt fact and fiction, and those who believe in friction betwixt fact and fiction, would cause further fragmentation between these opposing factions.
Yeah.
In fact, whereas to the pernicious, factitious, this is further fragmentation. To the fickle, fictitious, it's merely a fractal fragment of fict.
Yeah, but I guess I understand where you're heading with it, yeah, I also just want to say with that, I think actually what you could call the destabilization of the truth is an opportunity that we should reach out and grasp, you know, with all, what you're calling, by all means necessary, bam. Yeah, other questions? Yeah?
Thanks very much for this presentation. I'm looking at the system here. Can you help me understand what is unique about occult fiction in this respect? Because it seems to me the attempt to generate a new world is something that every single work of fiction does, from Charles Dickens to
yeah, I think I think it has something to offer in going forward in this kind of idea about another way of thinking, another way of relating to the world. So I don't think, I mean, that's the occult per se, right? I think with occult fiction, it bleeds into that idea about the weird, so it engages with the outside, mysteries. But to me, I haven't really made strict definitions, so I am also I know I'm kind of blurring all the terms and making them sort of weirdly synonymous with each other. You know what I mean? But
occult fiction maybe has a particular set of ideas about how to make this.
I think occult fiction basically is sort of describing another world in relation to, you know, the rational world or the causal world. So it's another world, another way of relating to the world. I don't know if that sounds like completely banal. Pardon? As opposed to like a rationality or causality or like proper realism. It has that idea, I don't know, about revelation maybe, or prophecy or something like that. But yeah, I haven't really defined it in strict terms, what occult literature is. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about these slang centers. I've never heard of that before. And of course, I've always been interested in one novel by Silky.
Yeah.
I haven't read this one, but it sounds a little bit similar. Of course, he was also a Scientologist, and that calls to mind another person who did this,
L. Ron Hubbard. Yeah.
That's very fascinating for me to learn about that. What were these centers? Were they Scientology-like groups, or were they like fan fiction type things?
Yeah, I think they were kind of fan fiction utopias where they were playing with the idea about evolution and, you know, evolving psi powers and psychic abilities in particular. And they came out of the science fiction network, the fan networks that came up around scenes in the 1940s. But I mean, obviously from that, the science fiction writers based around LA and all that, L. Ron Hubbard is very much part of the same, even though I think L. Ron Hubbard came up through the Agape Lodge, right? So he came out of Jack Parsons' OTO. Yeah, also, right? But I think it all kind of, at that time, science fiction became this kind of utopian reservoir of ideas. I think it's also very sort of human, isn't it? But the fans are slants, so they're making these, they're kind of saying like, okay, we are already kind of superhumans, organizing, and I mean, that's where it goes into the eugenics discussions, right? Because they're like having a fan family program for making a kind of elitist community. It's in the US, so.
Just picking up on that, I'd just like to hear you think more. It seems to me that one of the secret links in the history of subcultures in the 20th century is the lack of acknowledgement of the role that science fiction fandom had in seeding the counterculture. You can follow it in the way you're talking about, or if you look at like a lot of the discourse of early rock writing comes out of science fiction fanzines. Paul Williams is a great example of somebody who does this. But it seems that it's like this connection that's waiting to be made in a robust and I think very important way. I haven't done it. I don't know other people who have done it. You mentioned it.
Yeah, I haven't done it either.
Doesn't it seem like it's kind of that it is actually really important? I guess I'm wondering whether you thought about it. Well, maybe in the end it's not that important, or whether you're like.
No, but I think totally that they're forerunners, right? And they're seeding the culture. And I think also, as I say, right, I mean, this is in the 40s. They are actually sort of like already talking with communes and free love and building this network idea of islands in the nest, where I think it completely, also people from the Kift and the early scout movement, they moved to California and became these nature boys who ran around in California, and also became, this idea, I guess it comes out of like German, like a Körperkultur or whatever they call it, right? When they're naked and vegetarian and doing yoga and all that kind of like taking ideas in from the East quite early in the 20th century. And I think all that kind of thing comes together in the 50s. It sort of reaches its momentum and begins to spread and become the counterculture.
I didn't know that I know that there were German influences on the nature boys.
Yeah. Some of them, they came along with that nature boys. I think that, what is it, the 10s and 20s and stuff like that, with connections both to the Wandervogel and the early scout movement, where I also just find it tremendously interesting that you can begin to build, that you're trying to realize a society and a kind of ritual way of living based on H. Rider Haggard and James Fenimore Cooper and that kind of stuff, right? It's like if we all went to Wales and read like Susan Cooper and started to build a cult on it, But yeah.
Regarding science fiction, I read this interesting article that stated that pretty much the only fiction that's going to age well is science fiction because of the way things are accelerating. That life is accelerating. Writers are becoming increasingly unable to face a plausible story in the past. And that anything that's placed in the present will be obsolete in a generation and misunderstood with Santa Forces and buttons and vacuum cleaners or whatever will be shortened.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, it's interesting that you put it that way because the occult and sort of supernatural appearing things are part and parcel of almost all sci-fi. There's some magic in all sci-fi.
Yeah, isn't that Arthur C. Clarke with any technology, yada yada? Yeah. Yeah, but I think that's the promise also of the cult, right, that it actually is a kind of a futurism. I also think with Eliphas Levi and all these, like, they were utopian socialists, right? They thought this would be a religion for the future that would become kind of social glue now that, like the hegemonic religion, whatever, is kind of disappearing. I also just want to say, I just want to plug one of my favorite novels talking about the Kift and talking about science fiction. I'm always thinking about Ridley Walker when I'm encountering the Kift, and I think Ridley Walker is actually just a really good novel. Russell Hoban, I think he's actually American, but it's you have to read it in your head in a weird British dialect in order to understand it, I guess. I don't know, but yeah. Any other questions?
Thanks so much.
Yeah, cheers.